Welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a scenario today that requires you to, well, mentally fast forward.
Right.
Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning, pouring your coffee and glancing at your phone, only to see that global financial markets have already shed trillions in value before the opening bell.
Absolute panic.
Completely. Transcontinental flights are grounded indefinitely. Brent crude is violently spiking by the hour, and every single news network is running the exact same breaking chyron.
An unprecedented multi-front military conflict has erupted across the Middle East.
Exactly. It's a direct kinetic war drawing in the United States, Israel, and Iran, operating on a scale and at a velocity we really haven't seen in generations.
I mean, it's the nightmare scenario that defense analysts and economists spend their entire careers modeling,
Yeah.
The transition from a simmering, decades-long shadow war of proxies and covert sabotage into blistering, open, conventional warfare.
Yeah.
And the text we are unpacking today doesn't just theorize about this. It provides a brutally granular, day-by-day architectural blueprint of how that collapse actually plays out.
Right. Our source material today is this exhaustive, highly specific thought experiment set in February and March of 2026.
The author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
Yes, publishing under the banner Barack Face. And he has constructed what can really only be described as a sprawling geopolitical and ideological manifesto.
He dubs this hypothetical conflict Operation Epic Fury.
Operation Epic Fury. And this isn't just a military white paper. Bhagat synthesizes modern tactical doctrine, macroeconomic choke points, and crucially, some deeply controversial religious theology into one massive framework.
Which is exactly why we need to be incredibly precise about our approach here.
Absolutely.
Because this text wades into incredibly fraught theological and geopolitical waters, it's really worth stating up front. Our goal today is strictly analytical.
Yes, strictly analytical.
The author makes highly contentious claims regarding Islam, regional history, and the political legitimacy of various states. We're here to map the architecture of Bhagat's argument, analyzing how he connects a ballistic missile exchange to a radical theological conclusion.
And to be unequivocally clear to you, the listener, we are not endorsing, validating, or supporting any of the political or religious viewpoints within this text.
Not at all.
Our job is to deconstruct the text exactly as it's written so you can understand the sheer scope of this scenario. We don't take sides, we're just the guides.
Exactly. We are treating this as an intricate machine, taking it apart piece by piece to see how the author believes the gears turn.
So here is the mission for this deep dive. We're going to track the timeline of Operation Epic Fury, analyzing the sheer logistical weight of the opening strikes.
And then we'll move into the tactical chessboard.
Right, the unsustainable math of modern drone warfare.
The invisible physics of electronic jamming.
And the terrifying synchronization of cyber-sabotage. From there, we map out the macroeconomic shockwaves, specifically how holding a single maritime choke point hostage alters the global order.
And finally, we will examine Bhagat's ultimate radical thesis.
That this physical war is entirely secondary to a spiritual revolution required from the Iranian diaspora.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the trigger point for a world war in 2026.
So, Bhagat sets the opening act on February 27, 2026. To understand the context he builds, you really have to look at the preceding months in his timeline.
Right, the diplomatic breakdown.
Exactly. Indirect nuclear talks between Washington and Tehran, which had been mediated through Oman, have completely collapsed.
The Oman back channel is dead.
Dead. And the text notes that this diplomatic failure follows a series of unilateral Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites back in June 2025.
So the diplomatic off-ramps have essentially been paved over.
Exactly. And so on the afternoon of February 27, the author posits that U.S. President Donald Trump issues a final go order.
Which brings us to February 28th, day one of Operation Epic Fury.
The opening salvo.
And the sheer volume of the initial kinetic strike detailed in the text is staggering. I mean, Bhagat describes a synchronized preemptive assault where the U.S. and Israel launch approximately 900 strikes in a 12-hour window.
900.
In 12 hours. We are talking about the integration of B-2 stealth bombers, F-35 fighter jets, and over 100 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval assets.
Let's just pause on that number for a second, because 900 strikes in 12 hours is an astronomical sortie generation rate.
Yeah, the logistics alone.
Right. It requires a level of airspace deconfliction, mid-air refueling logistics, and real-time intelligence gathering that pushes the absolute limits of modern military capability.
The author isn't describing a warning shot here.
No, this is a comprehensive, theater-wide dismantling operation.
And the target list Pagat specifies focuses on the foundational pillars of Iran's strategic capability.
He specifically lists the deeply buried nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan.
Alongside a sweeping suppression of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC bases, and ballistic missile launch sites.
But Vigat doesn't just outline an infrastructure attack. He explicitly details what military strategists term a decapitation strategy.
Right. In this timeline, the opening salvo results in the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, Defense Minister Amir Nasirzadeh, and a swath of other top-tier leadership.
The objective is to sever the head from the command and control apparatus before it can issue coordinated retaliatory orders.
And I have to push back on the author's premise here.
Oh, sure.
Does a decapitation strike actually dismantle a structure like the IRGC? Because historically, removing top leadership in highly ideological, decentralized military structures sometimes just radicalizes the mid-level commanders who step into the vacuum.
Right, the Hydra effect.
Exactly. You cut off one head, three more appear. Does Bagat's text account for that?
That is the critical tension in his thesis. Bagat's entire premise relies on the idea that authoritarian regimes are brittle.
Brittle.
Okay. He models the Iranian system as a highly centralized, steep pyramid where intelligence flows and operational authority are jealously guarded at the absolute apex.
So no one at the bottom can make a move without the top saying so.
Right. His argument is that if you obliterate the apex, the mid-level commanders don't become a hydra. They become isolated, disorganized pockets of resistance, unable to execute complex theater-wide retaliation.
The author calculates that the command structure will wobble and fracture under the speed and weight of a 900-strike opening night.
Exactly.
Yet even in Fagat's own timeline, the pyramid manages to inflict devastating damage as it wobbles. We have to look at the grim, ground-level reality of the war he describes.
The collateral damage.
Yeah. He notes that in the chaos of this massive bombardment, a U.S. or Israeli missile, whether due to a targeting error, intercept debris, or an intelligence failure, strikes a girls' school in Manab.
A city down near Bandar Abbas.
Right. The text reports 165 civilian casualties, predominantly young girls.
It's a vital inclusion by the author, I think, because it strips away the sterile video game illusion of precision warfare.
Absolutely.
When you are operating at a cadence of 900 strikes in 12 hours, using munitions that carry hundreds or thousands of pounds of high explosives, catastrophic civilian collateral damage is a mathematical certainty.
The tragedy in Manab serves as the dark anchor to this thought experiment. It highlights the immediate human cost that spirals out of control the moment the go order is given.
And naturally, the retaliation is instantaneous.
Within hours, Iran unleashes waves of ballistic missiles targeting U.S. military installations across the Persian Gulf.
Specifically hitting bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE.
Which pushes us directly into the escalation phase of the author's timeline, from March 1st through March 10th.
The progression Bagat maps out is a rapid escalation of force. By day 3, the U.S. Central Command publicly states their objective is to daze Iran's military infrastructure.
While the regime attempts to stabilize its fractured pyramid.
Right. Sayed Mojtaba Khamenei is rapidly elevated to the role of supreme leader to plug the vacuum left by the day 1 decapitation strikes.
But the conflict only widens. By days 4 and 5, the author specifies that Iran begins deploying heavier, more sophisticated assets.
The text explicitly names the Khorramshahr 4 and Sijil missiles,
highlighting their one-ton warheads.
And Fagat points out that these aren't just larger explosions. Their terminal velocity and payload weight make them significantly harder for U.S. and Israeli defense grids to intercept.
Which leads directly to the breaking point by days 8 and 9.
The math simply catches up with them.
The author projects that the U.S. military begins issuing dire warnings regarding interceptor depletion.
Simultaneously, the text notes that civilian casualties inside Iran surpass 1,000, while U.S. and Israeli military casualties mount sharply under the barrage of heavier ballistic warheads.
If your 401k is tied to energy markets or if your business relies on global logistics, this 10-day timeline is an absolute nightmare.
Oh, completely.
The author is illustrating how a concentrated 4 to 5 week high-intensity campaign designed to shatter an authoritarian regime doesn't exist in a vacuum. It triggers an immediate global shock.
Right.
But the timeline itself is just the surface. To understand why the U.S. is running out of interceptors by day 8, we have to look under the hood at the mechanics of this war.
Which brings us to segment 2, the tactical chessboard.
Yes. Bagat frames this entire conflict around a terrifying asymmetry in the arsenals.
The numbers are wild here.
They really are. On one side, Iran commands an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 ballistic missiles, supplemented by thousands upon thousands of cheap, mass-produced drones.
He specifically cites the Shahed series, estimating production cost of roughly $20,000 per unit.
Right. And on the defending side, you have the most advanced interception grids on the planet, systems like the Patriot Pass-3 or Israel's Arrow and David's Sling.
But those interceptors cost anywhere from $3 million to $12 million every single time they leave the tube.
Millions for one shot.
It's an economic war of attrition, masquerading as an aerial battle. Shooting down a $20,000 drone with a $12 million interceptor missile is, well, it's like using a Ferrari to deliver a single pizza.
That's a great way to put it.
You might get the job done flawlessly, but you will bankrupt yourself long before you clear the backlog of orders.
The author is highlighting an unsustainable cost curve. If an adversary can manufacture 1,000 cheap drones for the price of your single interceptor, your technological superiority actually becomes a massive logistical vulnerability.
Which is exactly why Fagat details the necessity of the left-of-launch strategy.
Right. If you can't afford to shoot them down in the sky, you have to destroy them before they are fired.
Correct. So the term left-of-launch refers to the timeline of a missile strike. The launch itself is the 0 hour.
Okay.
Anything that happens after radar tracking, firing the interceptor, the kinetic kill in the atmosphere, is right of launch.
Got it.
The strategy Bagat describes involves shifting the entirety of the U.S. and Israeli focus to the left. You have to obliterate the manufacturing hubs, the storage depots, and the launch vehicles before the countdown even begins.
And the text gets highly specific about the munitions required for this. Bagat cites the deployment of GBU-57 bunker busters.
These are massive, 30,000-pound precision-guided bombs.
Dropped from B-2 stealth bombers?
And specifically designed to penetrate deep subterranean structures. The author notes they are targeting underground missile cities carved into the Zagros Mountains.
They are also utilizing F-15 fighter jets and HIMARS rocket artillery to hunt down mobile TELs, transporter erector launchers.
The trucks that move the missiles around.
Right. But frankly, looking at the geography, I have to question the feasibility of this left-of-launch doctrine.
How so?
Well, the Zagros mountain range is massive. Iran itself is roughly the size of Alaska. Hunting mobile missile trucks across that kind of varied mountainous terrain. I mean, we saw how difficult the Scud hunt was during the 1991 Gulf War.
And that was in the relatively flat Iraqi desert.
Exactly. Can a modern military actually achieve left-of-launch dominance against a decentralized network hidden under mountains?
You are hitting on the exact logistical friction point that makes this scenario so volatile.
Okay.
The author acknowledges that kinetic left-of-launch strikes, dropping GBU-57s on known tunnel entrances or hunting TLs with F-15s, can really only degrade a fraction of the total arsenal.
So they can't get everything.
Not even close. The sheer geography and subterranean depth provide the regime with a massive strategic buffer.
Right.
Therefore, relying purely on physical explosives creates a math problem the U.S. and Israel still cannot solve.
They still run out of interceptors.
Exactly, which is why the author argues the actual decisive blows in this scenario aren't kinetic at all. They happen in the invisible spectrum.
The electronic warfare component. This is where Bagat's text gets incredibly fascinating. He dives deeply into the science of electronic jamming, treating it not as a secondary support tactic, but as a primary weapon system.
In military parlance, jamming is a soft kill. You aren't destroying the drone's airframe. You are destroying its ability to navigate.
It's blinding it.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Modern loitering munitions and smart artillery rely heavily on GPS or GNSS satellite constellations to orient themselves and locate their targets.
Like the GPS on your phone.
Very similar. And the signals from those satellites beaming down from space are actually quite weak by the time they hit the Earth's surface.
Okay.
So a ground-based or airborne jammer simply floods the local radio frequency spectrum with high-powered noise.
So it's just louder than the satellite.
Exactly. It essentially screams directly into the drone's receiver, drowning out the whisper of the satellite. The drone loses its spatial awareness, drifts off its pre-programmed vector, and falls harmlessly into the desert.
And Fagat grounds this heavily in recent real-world data to prove its efficacy. He cites the conflict in Ukraine, pointing out that intense electronic jamming dropped the hit rate of highly sophisticated GPS-guided Excalibur artillery shells to a staggering 10%.
That's a 90% failure rate just from jamming.
It's wild.
Yeah.
He also notes that Ukrainian forces were losing up to 10,000 drones every single month simply due to invisible radio frequency interference.
That is an unbelievable attrition rate caused without firing a single bullet.
It is a phenomenal defensive shield, but the author introduces a terrifying counter-evolution. Warfare is a perpetual, rapidly accelerating arms race. If you build a perfect jammer, the adversary stops relying on radio signals.
They evolve.
Right. Foghat details how Iran, in this 2026 scenario, adapts their drone swarms to bypass the electromagnetic spectrum entirely. He specifically highlights the integration of visual SLAM technology.
Visual SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping.
What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, instead of pinging a satellite, the drone uses onboard optical sensors and AI algorithms to literally read the topography of the ground below it.
So it's looking out a window, basically.
Yeah, it matches the rivers, roads, and mountains it sees to a preloaded internal map. It navigates entirely by sight, making it completely immune to radio frequency jamming.
Because there's no radio signal to jam.
Precisely. The author also notes the use of fiber optic tethers.
Now this is wild.
It really is. This involves a drone physically trailing a spool of microscopic glass wire for 10 or 20 kilometers back to the human operator.
A physical wire attached to a flying drone.
Yeah, because the control signals are traveling as light pulses through a physical wire rather than as radio waves through the air. You cannot jam it.
This raises the critical mathematical dilemma of Foghat's scenario. He notes that while standard electronic jamming neutralizes 70 to 90% of basic commercial-grade drones, its effectiveness plummets below 50% against these advanced adapted models.
The ones utilizing visual SLAM or fiber optics?
Right. If your invisible shield drops below 50% efficacy and you've already burned through your stockpile of $12 million interceptors, the swarm gets through.
It's the cascade failure of a high-tech defense grid. Once the shield fractures, the physical infrastructure, the air bases, the radar domes, the command centers are entirely exposed to mass kinetic strikes.
But Foghat argues that the U.S. and Israel aren't just playing defense in the invisible spectrum. They are utilizing the digital realm to execute devastating offensive operations.
Which brings us to segment 3, the cyber battlefield.
Right. This is where the author introduces a modern twist on ancient strategy. He echoes Sun Tzu's philosophy that all warfare is based on deception, but applies it to the architecture of modern networks.
It is the concept of the digital Sun Tzu. Foghat's text outlines 4 specific pillars of cyber tactics deployed in Operation Epic Fury.
Let's go through them.
The first is deception and misdirection. This involves the deployment of military-grade honeypots, fake, isolated network architectures designed to look like critical command systems.
A trap.
A trap. They lure in Iranian hackers, trap them, and trace their origins. The author also mentions the weaponization of deepfakes to sow operational confusion.
Injecting synthetic audio or video into enemy communication channels?
Exactly. To misdirect troop movements or panic the civilian populace.
The second pillar he outlines is exploitation. This is the realm of high-stakes espionage. The author specifically cites the use of zero-day exploits.
These are the golden tickets of cyber warfare.
Right. The author's argument hinges on intelligence agencies hoarding these vulnerabilities flaws in the code of enemy air defense software that the original developers are completely unaware of.
Hence, 0 days since discovery.
Yes, and deploying them to siphon off blueprints or map network topologies long before the shooting starts.
The third pillar is disruption. This is the digital equivalent of blunt force trauma. Foghat discusses massive distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attacks acting as digital sieges.
Flooding the pipes.
By flooding Iranian military routers with petabytes of synthetic traffic, they render the communication networks completely inoperable. He also incorporates state-sponsored ransomware, locking up logistics and supply chain databases to paralyze the movement of physical munitions.
But the most crucial pillar, and the one the author leans on heavily for the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury, is sabotage.
This is where code reaches out and breaks physical machinery.
It's a scary concept, and Foghat grounds this in a very specific historical lineage. He cites the 1982 Siberian pipeline explosion,
Right.
arguing that a logic bomb allegedly implanted in the Soviet control software caused the pipeline pumps to drastically overpressurize, resulting in a massive physical detonation.
He also points to the 2007 Operation Orchard. In that instance, Israeli fighter jets crossed into Syrian airspace to destroy a suspected nuclear reactor.
But the air defenses didn't fire.
Because before they crossed the border, Israeli cyber units reportedly infiltrated the Syrian air defense grid. The radar operators stared at screens showing clear, empty skies, completely oblivious to the incoming strike package until the bombs were already detonating.
And of course, the text heavily relies on the precedent of Stuxnet in
The
2010.
classic example.
The malicious computer worm that specifically targeted the programmable logic controllers, the PLCs, at the Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz.
Stuxnet physically destroyed the centrifuges by manipulating their rotor speeds to tear themselves apart, all while feeding normal telemetry data back to the plant engineers.
They thought everything was fine while the machines destroyed themselves.
Bogat uses this historical lineage to build to his concept of time-on-target integration. In the 2026 scenario, cyber-sabotage isn't an isolated covert action. It is intricately woven into the kinetic strike package.
The timing is everything.
The text describes U.S. and Israeli cyber commands executing zero-day exploits to crash the Iranian Bavar 373 air defense radars and sever the command and control communication trunks to the exact millisecond that the B-2 bombers enter the airspace.
It is a seamless, terrifying synchronization.
The cyber attack acts as a digital flashbang, leaving the adversary deaf, dumb, and blind at the precise moment the physical ordnance arrives.
It makes you realize how utterly fragile a digitized society is. I mean, we assume efficiency equals strength, but Bogat's text argues that hyperconnectivity just creates an infinitely larger attack surface.
Yeah.
If a fortified military-grade radar network can be silently switched off by a string of code, the infrastructure governing daily civilian life, the power grid, water purification, the banking sector, is terrifyingly vulnerable to the exact same tactics.
But Bogat doesn't let the scenario remain purely military. He forces us to look at the macroeconomic leverage points.
Which brings us to segment 4, the economic choke point.
Because if Iran is facing an overwhelmingly superior conventional and cyber force, they have to alter the geography of the battlefield.
And they do this by targeting the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is arguably the single most critical vascular system of the global economy.
The text lays out the raw numbers to illustrate this vulnerability. Roughly 20 to 25% of the entire world's maritime oil trade and 20% of all global liquefied natural gas LNG shipments must transit through this narrow, easily contested waterway.
In Bogat's timeline, mining and closing the strait is Iran's immediate asymmetric countermove. It is designed as a short-term masterstroke.
The author models the immediate global fallout. Within days, the panic sends Brent crude oil skyrocketing by 20%, pushing it to $80 or $85 a barrel.
Lloyd's of London and other maritime insurance syndicates refused to underwrite tankers entering the Persian Gulf, effectively halting traffic even before physical mines strike a halt.
Global equities markets crater as supply chain projections are thrown into chaos.
Bogat presents this as a brilliant application of asymmetric leverage. The regime in Tehran knows it cannot win a prolonged attrition war against the U.S. Air Force.
So they don't try.
Right. By leveraging their geography, they don't have to. By simply dumping a mix of advanced acoustic mines and cheap contact mines into the strait and threatening commercial shipping with anti-ship cruise missiles from the coastline, they essentially take the global economy hostage.
The strategy is to inflict such excruciating financial pain on Western markets that the political pressure in Washington and European capitals forces a ceasefire simply to get the energy markets functioning again. It is economic extortion on a planetary scale. But Bogat analyzes this strategy beyond the first 30 days. He argues that while it serves as a brilliant short-term shock, closing the strait is ultimately an Achilles heel. He posits that it is long-term strategic suicide for Iran.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, because I look at the reliance of the West on that oil, and it seems like Iran holds an unassailable trump card. How does Bogat argue that this leverage eventually backfires?
Because of the collateral damage it inflicts on the nations Iran desperately needs as geopolitical allies or neutral observers.
Ah, okay.
When you sever the flow of oil and LNG through Hormuz, you aren't just punishing Washington or London. The author details how this disruption disproportionately strangles China's energy-hungry manufacturing sector, creating an immediate crisis in Beijing.
It threatens to collapse Europe's fragile energy grid.
Crucially, the text points out the devastating downstream effects on the developing world. Bogat notes that 1/3 of the global maritime supply of urea, a foundational component of agricultural fertilizer transits through Hormuz.
Urea, I wouldn't have even thought of that.
Most people don't. But if you trap that fertilizer in the Gulf, you disrupt agricultural planting cycles in Africa and Southeast Asia, engineering food shortages and potential famine across the global south.
So the author's argument is that you rapidly shift from being viewed as a regional combatant defending its sovereignty to a rogue actor actively starving the planet.
Exactly. And Fagat pulls from history to validate this economic paradox. He points to the 1973 Arab oil embargo and the tanker war of the 1980s, specifically Operation Earnest Will, where the U.S. Navy had to reflag and escort Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Gulf.
Right.
In those instances, attempting to weaponize the global energy supply didn't force capitulation. It unified fractured global powers into a massive coalition dedicated to crushing the disruption.
Pagat argues that if Iran chokes off China's energy and the global south's fertilizer, Beijing and non-aligned nations will abandon Tehran, prioritizing their own domestic survival over Iran's regional ambitions. I wonder, though, if Bagat underestimates Beijing's geopolitical calculus.
Absolutely.
Would China really turn against Iran, or would they simply blame the United States for initiating the conflict that caused the closure?
It's a fair point. The political spin could go either way.
Regardless, the author's point stands. Economic warfare of this magnitude guarantees global entanglement.
It does.
This macro-level view forces us to confront the ultimate purpose of this massive destruction. We arrive at segment 5, the unfinished war dilemma and the logic of regime change.
The big picture.
I want to pose the central question to you, the listener, that this entire thought experiment revolves around. If the U.S. and Israel are dropping 30,000-pound bunker busters and crippling the global economy, what exactly does winning look like?
This is the core of Bagat's thesis, and it is an aggressively hawkish stance. The argument articulated in the text is that stopping short of total structural regime change in Tehran guarantees a cycle of perpetual escalating future wars.
To the author, a negotiated ceasefire that allows the current clerical and military establishment to remain in power is nothing more than hitting the pause button to allow them to reload.
Bagat justifies this by pointing to the axis of resistance. He details the decades of investment Iran has made in establishing and arming a proxy network across the region.
Hezbollah in Lebanon,
Hamas in Gaza.
the Houthis in Yemen, and various militia groups in Iraq and Syria.
The author's analogy is that utilizing a massive military campaign merely to destroy a few nuclear enrichment sites and missile silos is like cutting the branches while leaving the roots intact. As long as the command structure survives, the regime will simply rebuild the silos and regrow the proxy branches.
To bolster this argument, Bagat leans heavily on historical examples of what he views as the catastrophic failure of unfinished wars. He specifically dissects the 1991 Gulf War.
Right. The U.S.-led coalition completely decimated Saddam Hussein's military apparatus in Kuwait and southern Iraq. But they halted the advance, stopping short of marching on Baghdad to dismantle the Ba'athist regime.
The author argues the result of that restraint was 12 years of brutal economic sanctions, the starvation of the Iraqi populace, constant low-intensity skirmishes in the no-fly zones, and ultimately the massively destabilizing 2003 invasion of Iraq.
The text implies that the failure to decisively end the regime in 1991 merely guaranteed a vastly more complex and bloody war a decade later.
He also extends this logic from military action to diplomacy. Bagat's text treats the 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, as the diplomatic equivalent of an unfinished war.
He frames the agreement not as a triumph of nonproliferation, but as a temporary flawed appeasement that merely delayed an inevitable, more dangerous confrontation.
But we absolutely must apply historical friction to this hawkish argument. The Middle East is widely acknowledged by geopolitical scholars as the graveyard of regime change.
For good reason.
Look at the actual results of the 2003 invasion of Iraq or the 2011 intervention in Libya. The U.S. military is unparalleled at dismantling a sovereign government. That is the easy part.
The kinetic part.
Exactly. But building a stable, functioning nation-state in the aftermath of a decapitated regime is a monumental, often impossible task. The power vacuum left behind routinely invites decades of sectarian violence, massive insurgencies, and regional chaos that bleeds across borders. Does Bagat's text simply ignore the catastrophic track record of Western-imposed regime change?
He doesn't ignore it, actually. He attempts to argue why Iran is fundamentally immune to that specific type of collapse. Fagat lists a series of distinct sociopolitical factors that, in his view, separate Iran from states like Iraq or Libya.
What's the first one?
First, he points to a deep civilizational identity. He argues that unlike many regional nations whose borders were arbitrarily drawn by colonial powers like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Iran possesses a unified historical and cultural identity.
Persia.
Persia, that stretches back millennia. The text argues this inherent national cohesion prevents the state from fracturing along ethnic or sectarian lines once the top tier of government is removed.
He also leans heavily on demographics. The text highlights that Iran boasts an incredibly young, highly educated, and technologically connected population that harbors deep generational resentment toward the clerical establishment.
Fagat explicitly cites the Masa Amini protests as empirical proof that the populace is ideologically prepared for and actively desires a transition to a modern, secular democracy.
Finally, the author points to the existence of an organized, exiled opposition. The text specifically mentions figures like Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince, arguing that there is a government in waiting capable of stepping into the void, preventing the descent into warlordism that characterized post-Gaddafi Libya.
It is a remarkably optimistic projection of what happens after the bunker busters stop falling.
It really is.
But analytically, this is a terrifying tightrope walk. The question remains, what kind of peace are you actually capable of building? If you halt the war early, you leave an infuriated, heavily armed regime in place, validating Fagat's fear of a guaranteed future conflict. But if you push for total victory and regime change, you are gambling the stability of the entire Middle East and the global economy on the hope that a massive, diverse nation seamlessly transitions to democracy rather than collapsing into a black hole of civil war.
Which brings us to the final and unequivocally the most controversial layer of the author's manifesto, segment 6, the ideological manifesto, the diaspora, and spiritual warfare.
The deepest part of the text.
Before we analyze this section, I must rigorously remind you, our listener, of the parameters of this deep dive. In this final segment, the author, Paramendra Kumar Bhagat, makes highly contentious, sweeping theological assertions regarding the origins, nature, and legitimacy of the Islamic faith.
Right.
Our mandate today is purely structural analysis. We are examining these claims solely to understand how the author inextricably links his geopolitical framework to his radical religious ideology. We, the hosts, do not endorse, validate, or support any of these theological conclusions. We are strictly here as your impartial guides, mapping the text exactly as it is written.
It is essential to maintain that analytical distance because, in this final section, Fagat abruptly pivots from the mathematics of ballistic missile intercepts and maritime insurance rates into deep, radical theology.
It's a sharp turn.
It is. The core thesis he presents here is that the physical war operation Epic Fury is almost secondary. The text asserts that genuine, lasting regime change cannot be delivered by B-2 bombers.
Instead, the author argues that the Iranian diaspora must lead a movement of what he terms spiritual clarity to ultimately dismantle the tyranny.
And the theological claims Fagat uses to construct this concept of spiritual clarity are absolute and extreme. The author asserts a historical narrative that Islam was not organically adopted, but brutally forced upon Iran's ancient Zoroastrian civilization.
Summarizing the historical conversion process as a mandate to become Muslim or die.
But the text moves beyond historical grievances into direct theological deconstruction. Bhagat asserts that Allah is not God, but is instead a profound deception. The text literally defines this deception as the devil.
To justify this claim, the author introduces a highly unique metaphorical proof, arguing that if Allah were truly the omnipotent creator God, there would be a second moon in the sky.
It's a very specific image.
Let's unpack that metaphor because it's a bizarre inclusion in a geopolitical manifesto.
Right.
What is the philosophical logic he is attempting to deploy with the second moon?
Analytically, the author is using the concept of a second moon to delineate between an infinite, limitless creator and what he perceives as a constrained, rule-bound deity.
Okay.
The implication in the text is that the true God is defined by boundless creation and omnipotence. In contrast, Fagat argues that the deity described in the Quran is rigid, demanding absolute, unquestioning submission without the allowance for free will or philosophical inquiry.
I see.
Therefore, the author concludes that a deity demanding such absolute tyrannical obedience cannot be divine, but must be a deceptive entity.
The author also attacks the historical foundations of the faith itself. The text explicitly claims there is no historic Muhammad, attempting to dismiss the existence of the prophet entirely.
Ultimately, Fagat synthesizes these claims to conclude that because Islam, in his interpretation, requires absolute obedience and strips the individual of free choice, it operates not as a faith, but as an anti-religion.
Understanding why the author constructs this radical theological framework is the key to decoding the entire manifesto. Fagat is not just writing a religious critique, he is deliberately, intrinsically linking the geopolitical actions of the Islamic Republic, their funding of proxy militias, their missile strikes, their brutal suppression of domestic protests, directly to their theological doctrine.
To the author, there is absolutely zero separation between the political and the religious. The state's actions are merely the physical manifestation of what he views as a corrupt theology.
Right. To Agat, the regime isn't just a flawed political system or an oppressive government. It is a manifestation of spiritual sickness.
Exactly. And this leads to his ultimate radical conclusion. A purely political revolution in Iran is impossible.
You cannot simply vote the regime out, and you cannot permanently bomb them out of existence.
The author argues that the diaspora must lead a complete, total spiritual renunciation of Islam. The text views this renunciation as breaking a bond with the devil.
In Fagat's worldview, the psychological and spiritual chains of the religion must be shattered before the physical chains of political tyranny can be broken. Spiritual liberation is the absolute prerequisite for political liberation.
I want you to step back and reflect on the immense gravity of that assertion. Think about how deeply intertwined identity, historical trauma, religion, and modern geopolitics are in this author's framework.
It's staggering. We began this deep dive discussing the cost-benefit analysis of using $12 million interceptors against $20,000 drones. We analyzed the global supply chain dominoes of closing the Strait of Hormuz. But to the author of this text, a conflict fought with hyper-advanced cyber viruses, AI-guided munitions, and global economic sanctions is, at its absolute core, a war of souls.
It perfectly illustrates why these regional conflicts are so intractable. When the stakes of a war are elevated from disputes over territorial boundaries or resource allocation into a binary struggle for divine truth and spiritual salvation, the concept of a negotiated compromise evaporates. You cannot sign a peace treaty in a war of souls.
Which brings all the threads of this massive thought experiment together. This has been an incredibly intense, multifaceted journey.
We covered a lot.
We started in the granular, logistical reality of a 2026 battlefield, analyzing the staggering sortie generation required for 900 strikes, the unsustainable economics of drone warfare, and the invisible physics of GNSS jamming and visual SLAM navigation.
We moved through the terrifying synchronization of the cyber battle.
We mapped the macroeconomic shockwaves, tracing how a few acoustic mines in the Strait of Hormuz could starve China of energy and the global south of agricultural fertilizer.
We debated the brutal historical math of regime change, weighing the hawkish demand for total victory against the horrific track record of state collapse in the Middle East.
And finally, we unpacked a radical, sweeping ideological manifesto that demands a spiritual revolution as the only viable exit strategy to a physical war.
And as we synthesize all of this, I want to leave you with a final, provocative concept to mull over. We have spent this deep dive analyzing a meticulously planned, massive conventional war. But we've also seen how modern warfare is devolving into an endless bleeding arms race of cheap, disposable tech, overwhelming, exquisite, expensive defense grids.
Yeah.
We've seen how physical borders are rendered meaningless by cyber weapons and economic choke points, and we've seen how ideological battles are fought just as fiercely across diaspora communities and digital networks as they are in the Zagros Mountains.
So what's the takeaway?
So the question is this. In the hyper-connected, deeply ideological landscape of the 21st century, does the historical concept of a decisive military victory even exist anymore? Can you ever truly sign an armistice, plant a flag, and declare conflict permanently resolved? Or are we now locked into an era where we simply manage perpetual asymmetric conflicts, where the battleground isn't just a stretch of desert, but is everywhere, all at once, extending from the global supply chain all the way down to the theology of the individual soul?
That is a phenomenal, heavy question to ponder, but it is exactly the kind of critical, wide-angle thinking we need to navigate the current geopolitical landscape. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly complex, demanding deep dive. We covered a massive amount of difficult, highly controversial ground today, but unpacking these intricate thought experiments and rigorously analyzing the mechanics and perspectives driving them is the only way we can make sense of a rapidly accelerating world. Keep questioning the architecture of the arguments you read, keep pushing beyond the surface to connect the logistical, economic, and ideological dots around you, and we will see you next time.